Hi everyone. Hope you can see my screen. Hi everyone, I'm Ye from Prime, the Principles for Responsible Management Education. Greetings to all of the participants. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. So I will be briefly introduce you a little bit about Prime. The initiative was established in 2007 by an international task force of deans, university presidents, and different academic institutions. So we are an United Nations sponsored initiative and a sister initiative of UN Global Compact, the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world. We are proud to say that now we have more than 880 signatories and we operate in 99 countries. We have 17 regional chapters. And also, last but not least, we have 9 working groups, including working group on peace for business for peace. So Prime working groups really enable us to achieve our mission and vision. They are networks that transform responsible management education by focusing on different issue topics in SDGs. These working groups operate through different initiatives, activities, webinars, as we have here today, to bring the educators, scholars, practitioners around the table in order to have those meaningful discussion to transform the responsible management education. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions. I think that's enough for the brief introduction of Prime. I will hand over back to Christina. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yi. I'm not going to share my screen today just to save time, since we don't have a lot of time actually to dedicate to the topic of today, but just tell you briefly that our working group was founded in 2014 by 2 academics, one, John Katsos, who is on the call, who will present some of his remarks from American University of Sharjah, and Robert McNulty from Bentley College. And the aim of the working group is to advance scholarly work, promote the practical application of scholarly work on the business for peace space. So looking at how businesses through their core operations can impact the conditions that often determine whether or not fragility and instability will lead or unfold into a durable peace, taking into consideration a multidimensional understanding of peace, where we look at not only the absence of indirect or physical violence, but also looking at direct and structural violence, such as inequity, inequality, and so forth. Or on the flip side, actually contribute to social tensions and inequality and so forth that could lead into an uptick in violence, for instance, or even armed conflict. And our activities are a bit multidimensional or twofold, in the sense that we try and promote scholarly work, and then we also organize webinars, for instance, like this one, where they may have more of a practitioner focus. And so although we specifically focus on academics or the academic space, we also understand that to kind of push the discussion around the nexus of business and peace, we also need to include a stakeholder, or take a multi-stakeholder approach, and also include practitioners and policymakers and civil society representatives. So I'll share, I think if Yi already hasn't done so, we'll share the website to our working group, and please feel free to get in touch if you're interested in learning more, or if you especially have ideas for future webinar topics. If I could go ahead and turn over to the topic of the day, I'm very eager to hear from our guest speaker, Ms. Daryna Dvornichenko, who is an associate professor and recently has become a visiting research fellow at Oxford University. She will share her reflections on women's engagement in politics and the economy before and after Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. The main topic, as you will have seen in the invitation, is Ukrainian political and economic landscape in the future. Is there a place for women? Daryna's bio, very distinguished professional background is included in the invitation, and I will include it in the link in the chat again, so you can see a bit more about her professional background if you haven't read about it before coming to the event. Daryna will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have our founding co-chair, John Katsas, who will provide remarks, followed by our communications manager at PRME, Sophie Kaki, who will tell you a little bit about how PRME has tried to mobilize, especially the academic community, to support our Ukrainian friends and colleagues. So Daryna, if I could turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Very, very excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased, and it's a big honor for me to be here. Can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because now I can see the screen where Christina is a bit frozen. May I just share my presentation for today? I hope that you can see the screen. So I'm really pleased to share with you the research of my findings, which was conducted partially within the German Marshall Fund of the United States and after the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine. I will mainly focus on the political and economic environment and the steps Ukraine has made in order to bring more women into them before the 24th of February and the challenges after the 24th of February. And last but not least, I will try to discuss with you what the future holds for Ukraine. So if we start with the politics, we can see that Ukraine has made several considerable efforts in order to make political environment more gender balanced. For instance, in 2019, the newly adopted electoral code provided for the introduction of the mandatory gender quotas of 40%. Before that, the gender quotas had the character of recommendations. Apart from that, the lawmakers also thought about the positioning of candidates in the electoral list, and the new rule was introduced that supposed that in each 5 positions, there should be not less than 2 women or 2 men. Another important step in order to attract more women into politics, and not only political environment, also was the establishment of new institutions, which mainstreamed gender balanced approach in different fields, including politics. That was particularly the establishment of the new position, Government Commissioner for Gender Equality, and the Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration was also assigned new functions regarding the gender equality. If we look at the data, statistics, we can observe that during the national elections, which were held in 2019, there was just 20% of women elected. But here it's important to note that these elections were held when mandatory quotas didn't apply yet. However, local elections were conducted when mandatory quotas already applied. And here we can see pretty interesting results. We observe here from this slide that the slight increase of the number of women elected as members of city councils, almost 3%. On the other hand, we see decrease in the number of women as members of village councils and members of settlement councils. Besides, women elected as mayors of villages, cities, and settlements also didn't have a lot of support. It was just 16% of women elected in 2020 in comparison with 31 in 2015. To these round of elections, when we're talking about mayors, quotas didn't apply, but still these data are pretty interesting. One of the explanations, this decrease might be the decentralization reform, as it provided that the local level communities received much more responsibilities, but also received much more financial resources and the power to decide how they are going to spend these financial resources, which is, of course, attractive for men. Another explanation, and we can actually speculate about it, there might be several explanations, and you might also offer your own. Another explanation might be also the huge increase in the amount of deposit the candidates had to pay for running in the elections. Generally, the local level elections are attractive for women civic activists who would like to be engaged in a more formal decision-making process, who do not usually have enough resources to be spent on elections and couldn't pay this deposit. That is why those women who were visible, who had popularity, who had support among communities, being civic activists, couldn't take part in the elections because of the amount of deposit they had to pay. So these are some side effects of the reforms, particularly decentralization reform, which was actually inspired by the European Union. As for the economic field, here we might mention also several achievements made by the Ukrainian government in order to make economic field more gender balanced. For instance, introduction of 14 days of paid paternity leave and the introduction of the same age to which women and men can retire with full pension benefits. So that's now 60 years old for both genders. However, if we look at the statistics again, we will see that women were mainly employed before the full-scale invasion on the 24th of February and are still mainly employed in those areas which are low paid. This is, first of all, education. Schools and universities are mainly female-dominated. Medicine, sport, hotels, restaurants, catering. As for the managers, here the following rule applies. The smaller the enterprise is, the bigger number of women who act as managers is there. So we can see that micro enterprises are managed by almost 30% of women, while large enterprises have only 15.9% of women in their management. The 24th of February has become a game changer for Ukraine, and I actually believe it has become a game changer for the European history in general. First of all, it triggered a huge displacement. Internal displacement is now, we can see, according to the data provided by UNHCR on the 13th of September, more than 6 million people are internally displaced, more than 7 million people, refugees from Ukraine, who left the territory of Ukraine and went to Europe, and 4 million of them have already received temporary protection. And we can actually expect the new waves of displacement outside Ukraine as the situation with infrastructure, electricity, water, heating is getting worse and worse, and the winter is approaching. 94% of those who left Ukraine are women with children. And the economic situation has also reacted fast to the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation. First of all, the unemployment rate is almost 30% right now in Ukraine, and it hit mainly women. 64% of women are currently unemployed. Outside Ukraine, what is interesting, according to the latest data provided by the Polish authorities, those women who left Ukraine after the 24th of February, 2/3 of them have already found a job in Poland, and a little bit less, but 50% have already found a job in Germany. Of course, Polish and German authorities admit that these jobs which women have received in Poland and Germany are lower than the qualifications, than women's qualifications. But anyway, that creates a new challenge for the Ukrainian government and new risks. How to make these women come back when the security situation is getting better. I would like to share with you some of my observations here regarding the situation we experience right now in Ukraine. The full-scale invasion exacerbated pre-existing gender inequalities. It's not just about wage gap, which was about 20% in Ukraine, but it's also domestic violence, which intensified during the COVID pandemic. And COVID pandemic hit Ukraine the same as any other European country. But then another challenge, the full-scale war, which Russia started, intensified the cases of domestic violence one more time. In the future, we might observe the new waves of the new increase of cases of domestic violence as the society is mainly traumatized right now. Women have faced significantly increased safety and protection risks, and these risks are connected. Not only these risks are true not only for women who are now inside Ukraine. Of course, we're talking here about conflict-related sexual violence, cases of which we identify in the de-occupied territories right now in Kharkiv region, in Kherson regions, in Kyiv region. But we are talking also about increased safety and protection risks for women who had to flee the war and went to other countries. Such cases as human trafficking have hugely increased and pose a risk for women outside Ukraine. Women have been pushed into unemployment or unprotected informal sectors of the economy. We might imagine the ordinary the average day of a Ukrainian woman right now, where there are no schools, no kindergartens working, no electricity, no water, because in most residential houses, the water depends on electricity, sometimes no heating. And these women has a lot of responsibilities, caretaking responsibilities, and here women, not only children, but also elderly people. In some cases, these women can be also the only breadwinners in their families, as men could join the army as volunteers without being paid. So in this case, women cannot keep on going, having the same employment as earlier, working from 9 to 6. That is why they have to find new forms of their employment, which are usually unprotected. And voices of women are not included meaningfully in formal decision-making. What we can observe right now is that women have a vital role in humanitarian response, in women volunteer. For example, women who are outside Ukraine protest. Women take care not only of children or elderly parents, but also take care of disabled dogs. You can see this picture here. So women actually take an active part in the society, and volunteering or doing community work necessary right now, it is an integral part of everyday life for all Ukrainian women. This work is not paid. On the level of families and communities, the role of women has increased, and they really have huge impact in decision-making process. They shape the decisions made at the level of families, or even the level of local communities, local organizations which are engaged in humanitarian response. But when we talk about formal decision-making at the level of public administration, here we do not see a lot of women. The increase of the the increased role of the military and the centralization of power actually created the situation when women are not included, and such issues as keeping gender equality or tendon or aspiration to have a gender balance, such issues are sidelined right now in Ukraine. We do remember that during the negotiations in April between Russia and Ukraine, there was no women at the table of negotiations. Some observations for the future, and here I will stop and give the floor to the exciting people who joined us. So what we might observe in the future is some kind of inclusion-exclusion paradox. So currently, women are included in a lot of aspects of society, such as volunteering, caretaking, making their living, earning money for the families, but it might facilitate their further exclusion in other aspects. The risk of emergence of stratification along the lines of where were you and what did you do during the war? We might observe it on the social networks. For instance, the accounts of women, members of local councils, where they post the information about their life and about their decisions for when women made the decision at the very beginning of the war to leave the country, they were highly criticized, condemned, even despite the fact that these women, members of the local councils, were eager to fulfill their functions in the online mode. Still, the society was not ready to accept the idea that someone might just leave for the safety reasons. And again, with the increased role of the military, in the future, we might observe the situation when the decisive role in your further life, so your contribution to the victory, your tangible contribution to the victory, here we mean the engagement in military, in the military, will play the decisive role on what positions you will get, whether you will be elected or not, etc. The risk of emergence of a new gender imbalanced electoral map. So we hope that Ukraine will have national elections in 2023, if the situation will allow, and local elections are going to be held in 2025. These are going to be the first national elections when the mandatory gender quota will apply. And if there will not be any amendments, of course, in this regard. But we do not know in terms of these huge displacement, we cannot predict right now how the electoral map of Ukraine will look like and what the demographic situation will look like in Ukraine in even half a year. Here I will probably stop and say thank you to you for your attention, and I will be ready to discuss with you the issues raised here and to hear your reaction. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Daryna. I think you bring a lot to the table, a lot of important information to the table for us to consider, especially with regards to the gender consequences of the war and what kind of potential impact that those may have on the post-war recovery. I think we'll have a few questions and comments for you after we turn over the virtual microphone to John and then Sophie, if that would be okay. John, could I hand it over to you?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Christina, for the invite, and thank you, Daryna, for that wonderful presentation. I think it adds insight to something that we see constantly in the news, but it adds an insight from the ground that make sure that we're taking everybody into account for what will hopefully be a sustainable peace sooner rather than later. My comments will really be based on some interviews that I've been conducting over the last 7 or 8 months with Ukrainian companies and with multinational companies that country and regional offices in Ukraine, and try to provide some context for what the business shift was before and after. So I'm taking a little bit on the theme of Daryna's before and after to say, from a business standpoint, what are some of the things that have changed? And we heard, so in the interviews with folks, we've done about 70 interviews now. These are all C-suite. We interviewed C-suite level executives at companies that were either headquartered in Ukraine pre-invasion, or who were the regional or country managers for multinationals. And they represented a pretty wide range of industries. So IT, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, logistics, and the like. One of the main things we found is that for both multinationals and for local companies, safety obviously became a main concern, and we heard some of that in Daryna's talk. With safety, though, it also became for multinationals an issue of sanctions. So many of the countries that were operating in Ukraine were also operating in Russia. Sometimes they had the same regional office in many cases, and this proved difficult for a lot of companies. In other cases, the Russian business was more than the Ukrainian business before the invasion. In fewer cases, it was vice versa. And so this put multinationals in a really tricky position. From a safety standpoint, some of the operational plans were pretty clear. And for Ukrainian companies, the safety standpoint it stood out really as by far the most important, as did the maintenance of operations. So ensuring that operations could be maintained. What was probably the most interesting for multinationals is we saw that a lot of them weren't necessarily looking to responsibly exit either environment. They were simply looking to exit. So conflict scared them off. And it's unclear when some of them might be able to come back, or might think that it's safe enough to come back, in spite of the fact that many businesses have been able to continue operations in large parts of the country. A lot of multinationals were simply scared off by the initial invasion from both countries, and so told us in interviews that they weren't looking to go back, and they had basically shifted operations almost entirely and weren't looking to return. For Ukrainian companies, it was more or less the opposite. So the companies that we interviewed were going out of their way to try to maintain as much of a sense of normalcy as possible. But as Daryna indicated in her talk, many of the companies have shifted to almost a military support role. We saw this particularly with logistics and energy companies, where they're not completely becoming taken over by the state, but they do so much work for the state and to benefit the military effort that very often they're able to have even more business, or even do even more operations than they were beforehand. But the negative of that is that they're also, at least in their own perception, they perceived their business as being substantially riskier. So we talked to one logistics CEO who described now having to do a lot of logistics work for the military and for the government, and that the drivers were under attack more regularly, that the safety of their employees on an ongoing basis became a much bigger concern than it obviously was before. So those are some of the findings we came up with individually for the Ukrainian and multinational companies. And I just want to talk briefly about some of the differences that we saw. I'd say one of the biggest differences was emotional. So there was a sense from Ukrainian company CEOs of hope that things would get much better, that Ukraine would be able to push this invading army out of Ukrainian territory. And yet, simultaneous to that, there were described feelings of sort of helplessness in the face of tragedy. Wasn't a single C-suite executive we spoke to who didn't have a personal story, who didn't have something that a way in which it personally affected them and their employees. Compare that with multinational executives who routinely express these feelings of hopelessness, They didn't feel hopeful about the situation at all. And yet they very much felt like they were in control of their own ability to do things. So they felt like they had support from headquarters, they had support from home governments to do whatever it is they felt they needed to do in the face of difficulties. So the other big difference we found between the two is that Ukrainian company CEOs routinely talked about the right thing to do. So what was the right thing to do? What should we be doing? How should we be supporting our countrymen? How should we be doing the right things? Whether that was about employment, whether that was about safety, whether it was about should we be letting off workers at certain hours versus other hours. When we talked to multinational company country managers, the conversation was very much about legal norms. What do we have to do to make sure we don't violate sanctions? What is the Ukrainian government mandating that we do? What are our home governments mandating that we do? There was a lot of talk about due diligence, and there was a lot of talk about making sure they were following the law so as not to expose themselves to legal liability, and particularly legal liability in home countries. There was concern about that. So that's sort of where our research stands at this point. I think I wanted to provide it mostly as sort of contextualizing a lot of what Daryna is talking about, because the impact on women was particularly acute in Ukraine because of, as Daryna noted, how it was before, and then what it will look like afterwards. The sort of the last thing that I'll note is within the business and peace space, we have a lot of great research about how to manage and deal with civil wars. We don't have a lot of great research on invasion context. This isn't a context in which it doesn't happen quite as much anymore. And so to a very real extent, this is more of an unknown from a research standpoint than lots of other situations. And one of the things that stands out is when you look at how Ukraine is positioned going forward versus how Russia is going forward. A lot of the risk factors that the folks who are doing work in conflict spaces look at for civil wars are very much present in Russia in ways they're not in Ukraine. And so as we look to, I thought Daryna did a nice job of saying, what will this look like after? And as we look at that, I think one of the underdeveloped conversations is, if the Russian invasion is pushed out and Russia is embroiled in a civil war, how does that impact Ukraine? And I think we maybe don't talk quite enough about the impact that would have, because it would be pretty major. So those are my 2 cents, and I think I got just under 10 minutes, which is what I was asked to do. So thank you everybody for coming, and I'll turn it over to Sophie, or I'll turn it back over to Christina. I'm sorry, who will introduce Sophie.
Sure, I think Sophie is about to join us. Maybe John, if you could share some of the links to your work that you've done on Ukraine in the chat, that would be really great. We'd really appreciate that for folks to learn more about what you're doing. And yes, we have Sophie on the line. Sophie, we briefly introduced you earlier. If we could turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about how Prime has tried to kind of catalyze or mobilize the academic community to support our Ukrainian friends and colleagues, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And sorry to be joining you late. I wish I could have joined just before, so I could have heard your wonderful presentation, Daryna, but I'll make sure to watch the recording, and just loved catching that last part from John as well. So I wish I could say that Prime has done more, really, because we can always do more. But I would say that there are some really amazing resources out there that already exist. And so I think we've kind of taken it, I'll mention kind of our 2-step approach. One has been a call to action for Ukraine, which is just a resource that we've accumulated from across the community and kind of put into one central document that is intended to be a living document, so it can always be added to, which I'll share here in a moment. And then the second is more operational, so kind of what we're doing on the Prime side to kind of deal with the current context. So just briefly on the more kind of boring or operational side, we really need we really need to kind of follow UN guidelines and what the UN Global Compact is doing in terms of practices with engaging with Russian and Ukrainian participants. So they've taken a pretty, let's say, neutral response, as many of you know. We're glad to say that Prime very early on took a relatively strong approach in putting out a statement condemning the war, but then also providing this kind of accumulation of resources as soon as possible. That said, in terms of our signatory membership, we've taken an approach where one, of course, offering extensive leniency to our Ukrainian colleagues in terms of reporting and financial contributions and supporting them in ways that we could, many informally. So connecting, in many cases, Ukrainian families with colleagues in other chapters, for example, some of our regional chapters that we're looking to either host people or share resources. And so this is just one example of kind of an informal connection that we've made. And then in terms of engaging with Russian signatories, we've taken this is a more Prime specific approach, since we are in the academic space, and it's a little bit different than the UN. It's in a special kind of space within that private sector and UN space. And so we've taken a more individual engagement approach rather than that institutional engagement approach until we can try and move forward at a later date. So I'll share here the call to action. So that was more on the kind of the operational side and actions that we're taking. But I'll just share my screen if that's okay, Christina, just to give you a visual of what this call to action looks like. It's available on our website. I'll send the link here. Again, this was put together earlier in the year and includes our initial statement, which came a couple months before actually the Global Compact made an official statement. So this is what we have also on our website that you can find there. A timeline of our response, and then it also has our specific call to actions to academics and academia specifically, which is around calling for these resources on online free courses, scholarships, of course, encouraging donations to reputable efforts, and the like. And then we've also accumulated, as I mentioned, some resources from across the community that already existed, which are doing a much better job than we could have ever done in kind of sourcing information, specifically Science for Ukraine, where we're being really an impressive map. And I think Daryna probably knows exactly what this is, but just an amazing resource of opportunities in the academic community for Ukrainian colleagues. So you see some resources here. Again, living documents, so we can always add to it. We've opened an email for the response. So I'll also put that in the chat. So in case you have additional resources that you feel should be on here, you can absolutely email them to that. And then we've also put places to donate, of course, and some of the responses from our community. So some from our immediate partners. So I'll share that here. If there's anything else, please let me know, Christina, if you want me to expand on anything, or if anyone has any questions. I do want to make sure you all have enough time for a Q&A from the great session. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophie. Maybe if we could open it up to our audience. If you all have any questions or comments in general to Daryna, John, or Sophie, please unmute yourself and tell us who you are. If you'd like to share your professional affiliation, that would be great. We have about 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes or so before the end of the call. Anybody like to jump in? Maybe I'd ask a question to John in general about kind of the general approach to the Western private sector with regards to this kind of growing interest in how business interacts or impacts peace. It seems as if there has, in a way, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's sort of been like a catalyst to further that discussion. And I'd just be curious to know what you think about that, and especially with regards to the interviews that you've conducted with multinational corporations. You know, we know that, right, Professor Kernigan-Webb, pardon, to just jump back in there again, we welcomed him to present his work last month, rather, He's been trying to push to have a formal discussion within the Global Compact on whether or not there should be an 11th peace principle. And we know that some other industry associations like the ICC in Paris have also started this peace fund where they're trying to encourage their members to designate a certain percentage of their revenue that would gear towards peace positive activities.
Yeah, I think companies are recognizing that it's more important. At the same time, I think so long as there's still dispute over what the word peace means, it will continue to be a problem. So, I mean, so there's a story that I've told that Christina's heard me tell before. When we started doing these interviews in Ukraine, and we were using the same interview instrument we've used in about 10 different conflict environments. And in there is very prominently the word peace. We ask a bunch of questions about peace. We had some multinational company interviews, everything went fine. We had a couple of Ukrainian interviews, and our second Ukrainian interviewee walked out of the room, just up and left. And when we were finally able to coax him back into the room, because he was simply enraged by the questions we were asking, and he basically sat down and said, we're not doing peace. That's not what we're doing. Peace is capitulation. Peace means we've lost. We're in it to win it. So we're here for victory, and we're here to kick out the Russian invaders. So there was a sense, and he was not the only one. So there was a sense among some of our interviewees that word was so loaded with a connotation that in that context that was unacceptable. And I don't think Ukraine is unique in that way. Maybe the way in which it's interpreted might be unique to Ukraine, fine. But I think that's part of the problem with companies as well, is it's a loaded term for a lot of people. And so I think the hard thing is to explain to companies what you started off talking about, Christina, which is it's not just about stopping people from shooting at each other. It's also about these underlying dynamics that lead to people shooting each other, and that we can measure and that we can tell you about, and that there's lots of really smart people doing lots of really good work about to help, right? That's gender equality, that's racial equality, that's income inequality, that's caste-based systems, right? So all those things lead to direct violence, and companies can have such an impact on those things. And companies know that. I think the good thing is that's actually sometimes an easier way to have the conversation with them, because a lot of companies get it, but they don't always get the connection between that and direct violence. So yeah, I think the one of the positive outcomes from a company standpoint of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that there's much more awareness of these issues. The problem is, as I hope I made clear with the multinationals, is that they're still very cowardly. Multinationals tend not to, with very few exceptions, multinationals tend to, the moment there's any kind of direct violence of any amount, they pick up and go. And the easier it is for them to pick up and go from their perspective, the better. And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the local economy. It's not good for the people who are working there, whether they're Ukrainian or not. It's not a positive. So if we can make them realize the kind of role that they play, I think the better off everybody is. Sorry, there's kind of a long answer to your question.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks, John. I don't know, Daryna, if you have any thoughts on that topic, or if anybody else has anything else they'd like to jump in on.
I absolutely agree with John, and thank John for your amazing insights. Yes, I actually also conducted interviews with women entrepreneurs who were outside Ukraine and inside Ukraine, but displaced. And the same trend that those who are outside Ukraine have much less hope and do not see bright future, don't look on the bright side of things, while those who are inside Ukraine, living every day with missiles striking, air alarms, they have a lot of hope. Yeah.
Christina, may I ask a question?
Yes, Koray, please jump in.
Hello, everyone. This is Koray from University of Rhode Island. I'm a business professor here. I look at some conservative countries in the Middle East. Women's participation in the workforce is lower than world average, and their lack of participation in political circles is, based on less work participation, is kind of understandable. But in Ukraine, and I took a quick look at your study, Daryna, in Moldova and in Georgia as well, women are very active in the workforce. Actually, there is a crisis of men. I mean, life expectancies are lower. I lived in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan, two former Soviet republics, which may be close in culture to Ukraine. Women are more reliable if you are going to hire someone. I mean, many men are drunk, irresponsible. So, I mean, I'm trying to reconcile this with the lack of or lower representation in political circles. I mean, women are more reliable, work harder, and when it comes to political representation, it's not just there. How can this be explained? Can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that women are really engaged in economic field in Ukraine, active in economy as hired employees, not as active as managers, but as hired employees. We can observe that women are really active. When we are talking about political participation, unfortunately, there is no such kind of spillover effect that if you're active in economic field, you will definitely get into politics. I would say that there is some kind of spillover effect when we are talking about the engagement of women in economic activities and later their engagement in the life of communities. At the local level, like civic engagement, also volunteering or setting up their non-government organizations, contributing to the communities. Yes, in this case, we might observe this kind of spillover effect. But on the level of, when we are talking about the level of formal politics here, the management of political parties, which decides who is going to be on the electoral list, plays the crucial role. And we still observe nepotism in Ukraine. We still observe a high degree of hidden arrangements, and we still observe that women who might be competitors for male-dominated political party management are not invited into the political activity, into the political party. And that's another issue which most women actually mentioned in their interviews. During the when the gender quotas, mandatory gender quotas were introduced, some political parties face the problem. And it was not the problem that there are just few women who would like to join the political parties. No, of course not. They face the problem that they have to choose and who is going to be on the electoral list. And their choice usually was the choice of those candidates who were so-called technical candidates, who were invited to take part in the elections, but then there was an arrangement that they will step down from their mandate. They will say, sorry, I don't want, after being elected, I don't want to be member of the local council, let's say, for example, anymore. In this case, the Ukrainian law does not provide any requirements, for example, that the substitution of the next candidate is possible only when the person who will replace the member of council is the same gender. No, there is no such requirement. So women were included into the list of political parties, and then they step down from their mandate and give the way to men. And that's another problem.
A follow-up question. How did Yulia Tymoshenko beat the odds? Did you have a chance to read her background, her organizing efforts? She was PM for almost 4 years, right?
Yulia Tymoshenko is definitely the example of the woman who is mainly related or affiliated with economic circles in Ukraine. She has a background in economic field. I wouldn't say that her popularity is very high right now in Ukraine, vice versa. I would definitely say that she is far from being popular right now in Ukraine, for sure. And that's another good example of Yulia Tymoshenko. When we say that women being in politics attract more women as they act as role models, in case of Yulia Tymoshenko, it's not true. She has never acted as a role model for women. She has never attracted women to join the politics. I would say that she was kind of anti-role model for women to join the politics. And, you know, sometimes men who are in power can do more for gender equality and can be more vocal in their positions and can speak more in favor of women and supporting them than some women. I think that this case of Yulia Tymoshenko.
Thank you, Koray. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Maybe if you'd like to share some of the work that you're focused on as it relates to Ukraine. I was actually hoping to invite Lavina, but I'm not sure that she saw my message. Lavina, can you hear me by chance? No, so maybe I'll also include a link to Lavina in the chat. Lavina is with the International Crisis Group. As I'm sure many of you all know, it's one of the most respected international organizations that focuses on peace and conflict situations or conflict dynamics. And they are organizing an event on Ukraine next week that may be of interest to folks too. So I'll share that in the chat. Well, I don't know, John or Daryna, if you have any closing remarks, maybe we could go ahead and turn that over to you, since we're already at a few minutes and before the hour.
First of all, would like to thank Christina for your invitation and to thank all of you for your attention. That's really, without exaggeration, that's a big honor for me. I just would like to reflect on what John said, that there is always a story behind each manager in Ukrainian companies. It's absolutely true. The war now, which is going on in Ukraine, it concerns everyone. There is always a story behind everyone in Ukraine. Either you are now in Ukraine or outside Ukraine. So, and that is why I think that it's a great moment for just observing absolutely new changes. The former tools, even, or as John said, the questionnaires which were used in other conflict areas do not work here, because what is going right now in Ukraine, it's absolutely unique for European history. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up with that, I mean, thank you again, everybody, for coming and attending. I think the key is right now to make sure that people don't get fatigued, because, and by people, I don't actually mean the folks in Ukraine, because as far as I can tell, Ukrainians have no fatigue button. In my experience with them, there's no quit. No one on the ground is quitting. I think the issue is that the support that's coming from the outside has made a significant impact. And it's on all of us to make sure that Ukraine is still at the top of the agenda, because it is the most critical issue. It's the most critical place, and support for Ukraine at this exact moment is support for a certain type of way of life and a certain background and a certain type of governance system. And the international community hasn't done a great job of stepping behind those countries when they've had issues like this in the past. And I think so far, they've done a pretty good job of supporting Ukraine, and it's just a matter of keeping it up. And to do that, it requires everybody to make sure that they're keeping it up and making sure that it's top of the agenda for their policymakers.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me too, I think that's the big concern, is to sustain the level of discussion that we have, especially with regards to the engagement of the private sector, not only in Ukraine, but in general in fragile and conflict affected environments. And I hope that also future business leaders, students who are in business and management faculties, that this level of discussion is also sustained. I presented my work at Vienna University on Tuesday, and it was on a different topic regarding forced migration in fragile and conflict affected environments and the role of the private sector. But they were all extremely interested to talk about the impact or engagement of the private sector in Ukraine and in Russia, of course, and what the broader implications of that may mean on the field and for them as future business leaders. So I do hope as well that we can continue to have this kind of discussion at the level that we're having, and to tell the personal story. So I think for me, that was why it was so important to have Daryna on this call, not only because of her as a distinguished researcher, but because she also has all these phenomenal stories that need to be told, that need to be amplified. So for me too, it was a very big privilege to have Daryna present to our working group, and John as well, thank you. And for Sophie to have included those insights on how Prime is also trying to support our Ukrainian friends. So with that, I suppose we'll round up, close the call. Again, the recording will be online in a week's time. We'll share an invitation or share an email with the link to the recording. And please stay tuned for future invitations for other webinars. The first one will be in the new year. We're going to have someone from the Institute for Economics and Peace have a bit more of a focused discussion on, as John said, what do we mean by peace in the first place, and how does that connect to the private sector? So again, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a good rest of the week. Thank you. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Daryna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Such a big privilege to have you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Daryna. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.